Today we are talking about Jormungandr again, but this time it's not a guide, we already covered that, but instead we will be talking about how this character is in the current meta, how he's in terms of his balance, and how his design is. Because I think that is absolutely worth talking about in Jormungandr's case. And that's due to a few reasons. Jormungandr on paper has a very strong kit. If you look at his base values and his scaling values and combine them, he actually has quite a lot of damage, quite a lot more than most other Guardians. His scaling isn't exactly insane unless you hit all 3 submerges of the ultimate, but for example looking at the 2 Consuming Bellow, his base damage starts at 360 with 50% scaling, so nothing to scoff at. Not super strong, but definitely not horrible. But if you get the full passive and you get the multiple procs through pools, then the damage can go up to a total of 540 base damage, which is more than, for example, Cerberus 2, minus the fact that it also has protection reduction, but then again Consuming Bellow has other benefits, and it has 80% scaling, which is also not bad as an addition to that. With the ultimate we can end up with over 1000 base damage if you hit all 3 of the instances of going into the ground, the submerged damage. Now the problem with Jormungandr, or the design philosophy with Jormungandr, is that he's a very big god, and I think also because of that rather slow. And that's not about his mobility, he's actually as fast as most other gods, he feels slow because he's bigger, but it's about his ability speed. Now the 2 especially has a very telegraphed windup, you can really not miss that and you will know when he's about to use his 2. But even the other abilities are rather slow with the exception of the 3. The 3 really is the only ability that is pretty much instant and where you can pop up very quickly as well. The 1, if it travels a bit of distance, takes quite some time, and especially the ultimate takes a massive amount of time. And that makes all these numbers very awkward in my opinion. It's hard to determine if a character is strong or weak when it is so difficult to hit the abilities. And the difficulty here will not decrease, but rather increase in the future. Normally, it's sometimes a bit harder to play a new god, or it's easier, but Jormungandr's kit isn't inherently hard. By design, most of his kit is very understandable, I'd say. It's a bit complex for the pools, but looking at just the pure damage that comes from the ultimate, it's not something that takes a lot of time to learn. On the other hand, what enemies will have to learn is how to juke the ultimate. And I've seen a few players that didn't really understand the ult yet and didn't really juke it very well, but I've also seen a few players that already understood how the ult works and how slowly it is, and they were able to juke it very well because of how telegraphed it is. And I think in the future that will become a bigger problem. People will learn how to play against this particular ultimate, and in that very moment, the damage that you can get out of that will be very limited. You will probably still get a decent amount of crash or emerge damage here and there, but I don't think the submerge is something that will be applied very often outside of already CC targets. And that brings us to the next issue. Now, if Jormungandr has setup from other characters, then he actually has a lot of damage. He can output a lot of damage with his 2 if someone CC'd long enough, and he can output a lot of damage with his entire combo and with his ultimate. The problem is that Jormungandr is inherently also a frontliner. He is the one that is supposed to set up for others. And doing so is kind of complicated when you're the one that needs the setup to really use your kit to the fullest potential. Now, I'm not saying that's not possible without setup, but I think if you really want to get everything out of Jormungandr, then you would want the enemies to be locked down as long as possible. And the ult is the biggest contradiction in that regard. Normally, when you think of a Guardian ult, even a more aggressive Guardian, like for example Cerberus or Kuzenbo, their ultimate has some form of control that impacts a teamfight. That is kind of how Guardians are expected to be. And Jormungandr doesn't really offer that. Yes, his submerge has a bit of a knock-up to it, but it's hardly the core mechanic of the ability. It's more of a brief disruption rather than an actual strong knock-up that would last for a very long time. And sure, you can use it for disruption, but the real big thing with the ultimate is the damage and people trying to avoid the ultimate because of this damage. But that means if you decide to use the ultimate in a teamfight, as you will most of the time, it kind of takes away any potential to use the rest of your kit. And that is normal for ultimates. They usually have a certain duration where you can't use other abilities. Understandably so, because they're supposed to have a big impact on their own. If Gab was able to use every other ability during the middle of this ult animation, that would probably be a bit broken. With Jormungandr, however, the ult lasts way longer than your typical ultimate. If we go back to the time when Xing Tian's ult had a very long windup, and that was kind of a joke, that is basically what Jormungandr is, but 3 times. Yes, he gets damage 3 times as well, so if you can land all that, that's great, and you get rid of CC. But in comparison, you sacrifice so much. And then I often found myself really considering not to use the ultimate in a team fight, even though it seemed like the ideal situation to use it. Often enough, I just use it as an escape in the laning phase, for example, if I got ganked, or just randomly moved across the map with it back to the lane, because really there wasn't much of a point in using it in other places, or really not being able to use it effectively enough. It is very nice for tower diving, I'll give it that, because of the way that you're getting targeted, or not targeted rather, while doing that, but that's pretty much about it. And then there's also his 1, which in most situations sets up the only combo that he has. He has to drop the 1 somewhere, and then he can use his 3 into his 2, or just his 2 depending on what he wants to do in that situation. But either way, the pool has to be down. And you only get the full benefit of the 3-2 combo if the enemy stands in or near the pool, so an enemy has to be stupid enough to do that in the first place. Additionally, especially in team fights, if the enemy decides to just walk away from your pool and just fight in the other direction, just push into you for example, then you just got this pool lying around there, and that's basically all it does. It's slow enough to avoid it most of the time, and even if you don't avoid it, it's not that much damage. And Jormungandr gets punished if he tries to lock you near the pool, because then he might not get the submerge into consuming bellow combo. So whatever Jormungandr does in a team fight really can easily put him behind if the enemy decides to play around it. You can still use your consuming bellow for damage reduction and to disrupt the enemies a little bit, but it's not exactly the craziest CC between the fact that it's a slow and a tremor rather than a full-on disrupt, and likewise submerge is a nice knockup, but it's also relatively small. So he's not really much of a teamfight CC guardian, but he's also not really that much else. His identity is still designed as a teamfight guardian. And I actually have a proposition what I think would change a lot about how his kit works. And that is Venomous Haste, the first ability being adjusted. Maybe with a little bit faster travel speed of the projectile, but that's secondary here. The thing is, right now he can have up to 9 toxic clouds out at the same time, but the ability has a 12-second cooldown and the cloud duration is 20 seconds. So you're not gonna see much of that in most situations, even with full CDR. So what I would propose, even if it requires some rebalancing of the character as a whole, is to decrease everything about the 1. Decrease the initial damage, maybe decrease the cloud damage as well, decrease the mana cost too, and then also decrease the cooldown. That way it's a lot more spammable. You can't just as easily avoid an entire bad situation of fight just by walking away from it. He has more potential to set up again and again, and is not as reliant on using his ult to get another pool out, and that makes the whole playstyle a lot more flexible and a lot more interesting. And it feels like that's how the 1 is meant to be, with this potential to play around it with every other ability, but right now the cooldown just doesn't allow for it. It's just a very normal long or medium long ability cooldown that goes completely against what the 1 stands for, in my eyes at least. But just to clarify here, I don't think Jormungandr as a character is weak. His base stats are actually similar to that of, for example, Kuzenbo, so that's not looking bad. And he also has, again, a very high amount of damage. He has multiple different CC tools, and he also has an incredibly strong passive of 2 different kinds. You can also see his full potential when it comes to clearing, really. In middle stages of the game, he can blow up a wave super quickly, and you can see the real damage that he can put out in those situations. And if you play it right, you can even get that a little bit earlier. I didn't actually figure that out by the time I was making the gameplay here yet. But at the end of the day, everything is still super telegraphed. And that, especially for his 2, also means that if you're laning against a Jormungandr, all you need to do is use your mobility ability when he uses his 2. After that, he doesn't really have anything against you. You can use the 3 and that's about it, and that's not a big threat. And even the damage of the 2 is of negligible unless he has really all 3 pools up in an area where he can easily hit you with them as well and you're standing in that area. So by avoiding the pool alone, you can avoid so much of his damage. Just go for the archers first and you're good. I don't think Jormungandr as a design is disappointing because I think he feels interesting enough, and especially the ultimate and the way he feels in lane is very much a nice reflection of what he's meant to be. And I also don't have too much of an issue with him blocking vision of allies sometimes as well, because I think that's just how he is intended to be. He's just a bit of a nuisance on the battlefield for everyone, but more for the enemies. But I really think that this whole cooldown thing should be looked at, and maybe his ability, windups and speeds in general, and then in return some of the damage numbers would have to be adjusted. So for example, if the ultimate is sped up, then of course it would have to have some decreased damage numbers. That's just my take. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you're new to the channel, feel free to sub button, maybe the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.